Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about the richest man in America, ending his life as a naked hermit with fingernails like corkscrews, surrounded by his own urine in glass jars. It reveals what happens when genius-level intelligence collides with a mind slowly eating itself from the inside. How does a man who dated movie stars and designed aircraft become so terrified of contamination that he couldn't bear to be touched? Picture the penthouse suite of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, 1966. The curtains are drawn, have been drawn for months. The air is stale, recycled through filters changed according to protocols so specific that written instructions run to dozens of pages. In the darkness, a skeletal figure sits naked in a white leather chair, his beard reaching to his waist, his fingernails curling yellow and thick because cutting them would require someone to touch him, and touch is contamination. Around him, along the baseboards, sit mason jars filled with urine, carefully labeled. This is Howard Hughes at 59. This is what his addiction looked like. To understand how Hughes arrived in that darkened room, we must go back to Houston, to the tall, awkward boy who lost his mother at 16. She died suddenly, and something in young Howard broke in a way that would only become visible decades later. His father followed 2 years after, leaving the 18-year-old heir to the Hughes Tool Company, patents that every oil company in Texas needed. He was suddenly, shockingly rich and completely alone. The young Hughes, who arrived in Hollywood in 1926, bore no resemblance to the hermit he'd become. He was 6'3", rail-thin but handsome, and he had money that seemed bottomless. He wanted to make movies, design airplanes, date the most beautiful women in the world. For a time, he did all three with manic intensity people mistook for ambition. He directed Hell's Angels, the most expensive film ever made, a World War I aviation epic he'd reshoot obsessively, spending $4 million, equivalent to $60 million today, because the clouds weren't right, because the explosions needed bigger. The film took 3 years. 3 stunt pilots died during production. Hughes himself flew aerial shots, crashed, fractured his skull. He was back in the air 6 weeks later, still bandaged. This was the pattern: obsession, perfection, physical destruction, and then doing it again, because stopping was not an option his mind allowed. The perfectionism was the seed. Everyone who knew Hughes in the 1930s remarked on it. He'd watch film rushes 50 times, looking for microscopic flaws no one else could see. He'd redesign aircraft components because the curve was 3 degrees off his calculations. He'd circle blocks in his car, unable to park, unable to commit, because what if there was a better space ahead? What if this choice was wrong? His lovers noticed other things. Katharine Hepburn, who lived with him 3 years, in the mid-30s, spoke carefully about his peculiarities, how he'd wash his hands repeatedly before dinner, how he'd make her use separate telephones, one incoming, one outgoing, to avoid contamination, how he'd become fixated on a single meal and eat nothing else for weeks, steak cut to precise dimensions, peas counted by number, everything arranged on the plate, according to a pattern only he understood. But he was still functional, still brilliant. He set the world speed record in an aircraft of his own design, flying 352 miles per hour in 1935. He flew around the world in 91 hours, a record that made him an international hero. He bought airlines, designed bombers, dated Ava Gardner and Ginger Rogers, and half of Hollywood. The compulsions were there, growing like mold in dark corners, but the facade held. The crash in 1946 nearly killed him. Testing the XF-11 reconnaissance plane, his own design, when it malfunctioned over Beverly Hills. He plowed through a neighborhood, sheared off a house roof, emerged from the wreckage with a crushed chest, collapsed lung, 8 broken ribs, burns across his body. The doctors gave him morphine, then more morphine, then codeine when they worried about addiction. But the real addiction wasn't to drugs. He'd kick the painkillers eventually through sheer willpower. The real addiction was to control. Lying in that hospital bed, broken and helpless, his mind seized on the one thing it could control: cleanliness, germs, contamination, the invisible threats that proper procedures could eliminate. If he could just create the right system, write the right protocols, enforce the right rituals, nothing bad could happen. Nothing could touch him. The rituals multiplied like bacteria. By the early 1950s, his aides received typed instructions, eventually hundreds of pages, on how to handle every object that might come near Hughes. A memo about serving canned fruit specified 9 steps, including washing the can repeatedly, placing it on paper towels, opening it with a sterile opener washed according to separate protocol, transferring contents without letting fruit touch the can's exterior. Another memo detailed opening doors, using multiple Kleenex tissues as barriers between skin and doorknob, each tissue used once then disposed of in a specific manner. The Kleenex boxes became his signature. He wore them on his feet like slippers because floors were contaminated. Everyone walked on floors, tracked in filth from streets, from public bathrooms, from the teeming masses. The tissue boxes were clean or cleaner, a barrier between him and the world. His staff called them the Mormon Mafia. Young Latter-day Saints men hired to care for him, chosen because they didn't drink or smoke, because they were clean, because they'd follow orders without question. They fed him precisely specified meals, managed medications, and most importantly, became his buffer against a world too contaminated to touch. By 1966, when he moved into the Desert Inn's penthouse, Hughes hadn't cut his hair or nails in years. He sat naked because clothes touched too much skin, created too much friction, too many contamination opportunities. He weighed perhaps 90 pounds. His 6'3" frame collapsed into angles that barely seemed human. He watched movies in darkness, the same films repeatedly, always westerns, stories of men in clean, wide-open spaces where germs couldn't survive. The urine jars accumulated because using the bathroom required getting up, walking across contaminated floors, touching door handles, sitting on a toilet seat. Better to remain in the chair, to maintain the purity field he'd created, to let mason jars collect along walls. Staff removed them according to written protocols. Everything was protocols now. His life had become nothing but rituals designed to protect it. He moved from hotel to hotel, Las Vegas, the Bahamas, Nicaragua, London, always in darkness, always in penthouse suites, rented for months or years, always surrounded by Mormon handlers and elaborate systems for keeping the world at bay. He conducted business through phone calls, his voice thin and reedy, instructions growing erratic. He bought hotels he never saw, airlines he never flew on, casinos he never walked through. On April the 5th, 1976, on a plane from Acapulco to Houston, Howard Hughes died. He weighed 90 pounds. His hair reached to the middle of his back. His fingernails were 2 inches long, curled like talons. The FBI used fingerprints to identify him because he'd become unrecognizable as human, let alone as one of the most famous men of the 20th century. The autopsy revealed kidney failure, malnutrition, dehydration. Broken hypodermic needles were embedded in his arms from years of codeine injections. But the real cause of death, the addiction that killed him, isn't on any medical report. It was the addiction to control, to purity, to the impossible dream of a life untouched by the contaminated world. His mind promised that rituals would keep him safe. And they did. They kept him so safe that nothing could reach him. Not love, not sunlight, not life itself. Only in the very end, when his body simply gave up, did the world finally touch Howard Hughes again. The story you're about to hear is about a girl who became the most famous teenager in the world, and how the studio that made her a star also made her an addict before she turned 16. It reveals the price of being Dorothy Gale, of singing over rainbows while your body is being systematically poisoned by the people who call themselves your protectors. What happens when childhood itself becomes something you need pills to survive? Consider the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio lot in Culver City, 1939. A 17-year-old girl reports to makeup at 5 in the morning, already exhausted from yesterday's 14-hour shoot. A studio doctor appears with a paper cup. In it, several small pills, amphetamines, though she doesn't know the medical term. She knows them only as pep pills, the things that help her stay awake, stay thin, stay energetic through take after take after take. She swallows them dry, the way she's learned to do. By 6, she's vibrating with chemical energy, ready to skip down yellow brick roads she's already walked 50 times. At midnight, when the shooting finally wraps, another doctor appears with different pills. Barbiturates this time, sleeping pills, to bring her crashing back down. This is the cycle. This is what MGM called taking care of their investment. Frances Ethel Gum was born in Grand Rapids, Minnesota in 1922, the youngest of 3 daughters to vaudeville parents who put her on stage before she could properly walk. By the time she was Frances, no longer, transformed into Judy Garland by studio decree, she was already a performer's performer. Big voice, bigger emotions, and a desperate need to please that every predator in Hollywood could smell from miles away. Louis B. Mayer signed her to MGM at 13. He had a particular vision for his studio: wholesome, family entertainment, nothing that would upset Middle America. And he had a particular problem with Judy. She was talented, perhaps the most talented young singer he'd ever heard, but she wasn't conventionally pretty, not like the other starlets. She was, in his words, his little hunchback. He said this to her face. He put her on a diet that started at 1,800 calories and eventually dropped to 800, barely enough to sustain a child. When she got hungry, and she was always hungry, they gave her pills to kill the appetite. When the pills made her jittery and unable to sleep, they gave her different pills to knock her out. The studio assigned her a handler, a woman whose job was to follow Judy everywhere with 2 bottles of pills. Amphetamines in the morning, before every shoot, sometimes during lunch if her energy flagged. Barbiturates at night to quiet the racing heart and shaking hands the amphetamines caused. This was 1937, 1938, years before anyone understood addiction, years before warnings about mixing uppers and downers, years before it occurred to anyone that doing this to a child might be monstrous. The Wizard of Oz made her immortal. Every person who has ever been young knows Dorothy's journey, knows that voice singing "Over the Rainbow" with a yearning that seems to come from somewhere beyond performance. And perhaps it did. Perhaps what we hear in that voice is a 15-year-old girl who already understood, in some deep place she couldn't articulate, that the real world was not a place where problems got solved, where you could click your heels and go home. The real world was the place where they gave you pills to be smaller, pills to be faster, pills to stop feeling the hunger and the exhaustion and the wrongness of it all. After Oz, they worked her harder. She made 3 films in 1940, 3 more in 1941. Strike Up the Band, Babes on Broadway, For Me and My Gal. The titles blur together, upbeat musicals where she played variations on the same character, plucky, talented, in love with someone just out of reach. Between takes, she took pills. The studio doctor, they called him Dr. Feelgood, though not to his face, had an office right on the lot. Easier that way. Any time a star needed a pick-me-up or a come-down, there he was with his prescription pad. By the time she was 18, Judy was taking pills before breakfast, during breakfast, after lunch, before dinner, before bed. Not because she wanted to. She'd developed a terror of them, would sometimes hold the pills in her hand for long minutes, crying, before finally swallowing them, because not taking them meant disappointing people. And disappointing people was the one thing Judy Garland could never do. Her first husband, the musician David Rose, later described finding her in their bathroom at 3 a.m, pacing and talking rapidly to herself, so wired on amphetamines that sleep was impossible, even with the barbiturates. The pills changed her. The bright-eyed girl from Minnesota developed a reputation for tardiness, for erratic behavior, for showing up to set and not knowing her lines. The studio blamed her, called her difficult, unprofessional. They never mentioned that they'd spent years deliberately addicting her to contradictory substances, that her body and brain no longer functioned normally without chemical intervention. In 1950, MGM suspended her during the filming of Annie Get Your Gun. She'd been late, yes, but she'd also been taking 40 pills a day by then, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold props, her memory so fragmented by the competing drugs that she'd forget the scenes she'd rehearsed that morning. The studio, having created this disaster, decided she was the problem. They replaced her with Betty Hutton. Later that year, they fired her completely. 17 years at MGM, from child star to box office poison. and they let her go with the kind of casual cruelty only a studio system could manage. She tried to die that year, slitting her throat in a bathroom. It wasn't the first attempt, and it wouldn't be the last. The pills had become her entire reality by then. She needed them to wake up, needed them to perform, needed them to sleep, needed them to quiet the voice in her head that said she was fat, untalented, unlovable, the voice that sounded exactly like Louis B. Mayer. The next 15 years were a blur of comebacks and collapses. She'd clean up, perform brilliantly, get cast in a film, then fall apart again when the pressure mounted and the only way to cope was the old way, the way they taught her when she was young enough to think adults knew what they were doing. She was electric in A Star is Born in 1954, nearly won an Oscar. The performance required everything she had, and she gave it, gave too much, really, spent herself so completely that she collapsed afterward and couldn't work for months. She married 5 times, searching for someone who could save her from herself. None of them could. The addiction was too deep by then, written into her nervous system. Her children, Liza, Lorna, Joey, grew up watching their mother's moods swing wildly, watching her take pills from a dozen different bottles, watching her nod off mid-sentence or vibrate with manic energy. They loved her desperately and helplessly, the way children love impossible parents. By the late 1960s, Judy was performing in small venues, sometimes barely able to finish shows, sometimes brilliant, never quite sure which version of herself would show up. Her body was failing. Years of amphetamines had ruined her metabolism, wrecked her heart. Years of barbiturates had damaged her liver and kidneys. She was 47, but looked 60, her face puffy, her hands trembling, her voice, that magnificent voice, worn thin. On June 22, 1969, in a small house in London, her 5th husband found her dead in the bathroom. She'd locked herself in sometime during the night. The official cause was an accidental overdose of barbiturates, though whether it was truly accidental or whether she'd finally, deliberately, taken enough to stop the cycle forever, no one can say. She weighed 90 pounds. Her body contained traces of dozens of different drugs. They gave her a memorial service at the Judy Garland Pavilion in New York. 22,000 people filed past her casket. All of them had loved Dorothy, had loved the girl who sang about rainbows. Few of them had known what it cost her to be that girl. Few of them knew that MGM had started feeding her pills at 14, and that she'd spent the next 33 years trying and failing to escape what they'd done to her. Judy Garland didn't die from barbiturates. She died from being turned into a product before she was old enough to consent, from having her body chemistry permanently altered in service to God, a studio's bottom line, from learning that love, from audiences, from studios, from husbands, was always conditional on her ability to perform. The pills were just the mechanism. The addiction was to survival itself. And in the end, even that wasn't enough to keep her alive. The story you're about to hear is about Hollywood's greatest swashbuckler, spending his nights in Chinatown, smoking opium, and his mornings barely functional on set. It reveals the double life of a man who seemed to embody adventure and vitality while slowly poisoning himself in underground rooms that smelled of smoke and rot. How does a movie star who played heroes become addicted to a drug that turns you into a ghost. Picture a narrow alley off Alameda Street in Los Angeles, 1938. The year is irrelevant, really. It could be any year between 1935 and 1945. After midnight, a tall figure in an expensive overcoat picks his way past sleeping vagrants and pools of liquid better left unexamined. He knows exactly where he's going. 3 blocks down, second door on the left. No sign. Nothing to indicate what happens inside. He knocks twice, then once, then twice again. An elderly Chinese man opens the door just wide enough to verify the visitor's face, then admits him into a world that exists in deliberate defiance of everything the movie screen represents. Inside, the air is thick. Incense and opium smoke and unwashed bodies and something sweet and rotten underneath it all. The room is dim, lit by lanterns that throw more shadow than light. Along the walls, wooden bunks stacked 3 high. On each bunk, a figure lies motionless or nearly so, curled around a pipe, the drug doing what it does best, transforming reality into something softer, something bearable. The tall man pays in cash, always cash, more than the going rate, because discretion costs extra when you're Errol Flynn. He'd come to Hollywood in 1935, an Australian nobody who looked like a Greek god. Within a year, he was Captain Blood, the pirate with the knowing smile and the way with a sword that made men want to be him and women want to be with him. The adventures of Robin Hood, the Seahawk, they died with their boots on. A string of swashbucklers that defined heroism for a generation. On screen, he was vigor itself, leaping and fighting and loving with an energy that seemed boundless. Off screen, he was already using. The opium had started innocuously enough, the way these things often do. Someone at a party, someone with connections to the networks that had brought the drug to California with Chinese railroad workers 50 years earlier. Networks that had gone underground after the laws changed but never disappeared, because addiction is a market that regulates itself. Flynn tried it once, twice, found that it smoothed the edges of his anxiety, the nervousness that no one who saw him on screen would believe he possessed. The cigarettes and the alcohol weren't enough anymore. The opium was. By 1938, he was a regular at 3 different dens scattered across Los Angeles' Chinatown. He varied his locations. Again, discretion. But the ritual was always the same. Arrive after midnight, stay until dawn, smoke pipe after pipe, while the drug pulled him down into a stupor that felt like peace. Then drive home, sometimes barely able to hold the steering wheel, sleep for 3 hours, and show up to the Warner Brothers lot at 6 a.m. for hair and makeup. His colleagues noticed. How could they not? The tardiness, the bloodshot eyes, the way he'd sometimes drift mid-scene, his eyes focusing on something no one else could see. They called it the Flynn flu, that knowing laugh that Hollywood people have when everyone understands the joke, but no one says it aloud. The directors learned to schedule his difficult scenes early, before the shake started, before he'd need to disappear to his trailer for long minutes. His makeup team became experts at covering the grey cast his skin took on, the hollows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. The studio knew. Of course, the studio knew. Jack Warner himself pulled Flynn aside in 1940. After an incident where Flynn had fallen asleep mid-take, the opium from the night before still heavy in his system, Warner didn't threaten, didn't moralize. He simply explained the mathematics. Flynn was worth millions to the studio. These films, these hero roles, they required a certain image. As long as Flynn could maintain that image on screen, what he did off-screen was his business. But if the drugs started showing in the dailies, if they started costing the studio money, well, there were other handsome men in Hollywood. None as charismatic as Flynn, perhaps, but marketable nonetheless. Flynn heard the message. He tried to cut back, even managed to stay away from the dens for weeks at a time. But opium is patient. The withdrawal was ugly, sweating, shaking, nausea, anxiety that felt like insects crawling under his skin. And the thing about being a movie star is that your problems are never private. The press followed him everywhere, looking for stories. His marriages, 3 of them, each more disastrous than the last, provided ample material. The statutory rape trial in 1942, where he was acquitted, but never quite cleared in the public imagination. The drinking, the womanizing, the parties that lasted for days. The opium was the one secret he mostly kept. Oh, there were rumors. In Hollywood, there are always rumors. But nothing concrete. Nothing the gossip columnists could print. The Chinese men who ran the dens understood discretion in ways that starlets and bartenders never would. They kept no records, knew no names, and when Flynn arrived at their doors in the small hours, they simply showed him to a bunk and brought him a pipe and let the drug do its work. By 1945, he'd added morphine to the mix. It was easier to obtain. Doctors were remarkably generous with prescriptions when you were rich and famous. And it had the advantage of being legal, more or less. He'd tell them about war injuries, about chronic pain from stunt work, about insomnia that nothing else could touch. They'd write the prescriptions, and he'd fill them at different pharmacies, careful not to establish a pattern. The shower, morphine, was cleaner than opium, more reliable, but also more demanding. The doses increased steadily. His body adapted, required more to achieve the same effect. The roles started changing in the late 40s. Fewer swashbucklers, more character parts. Partially this was age. He was pushing 40, and Hollywood has never been kind to aging action stars. But partially it was the drugs, the way they'd softened his jawline, dulled the spark in his eyes. The camera sees everything eventually. The vigor that had made him a star was leaking away, replaced by a bloated imitation that required heavier makeup and more careful lighting to maintain. He knew he was dying. By 1950, he was frank about it with friends, the few friends he had left who hadn't been driven away by his erratic behavior and his inability to show up when promised. The opium and morphine and alcohol, always the alcohol, rivers of it, had wrecked his liver, his heart, his kidneys. He was 50 years old, but looked 70. The beautiful face collapsed into jowls and broken capillaries. His last film was Cuban Rebel Girls in 1959, a vanity project so terrible it became a joke. He played himself, essentially, or a version of himself, the aging adventurer, still chasing excitement, still pretending vigor he no longer possessed. The film was never properly released. By then, it didn't matter. On October 14th, 1959. In Vancouver, Errol Flynn died in an apartment belonging to a doctor he'd convinced to give him morphine. The official cause was heart attack, which was true as far as it went. But the real cause was decades of systematic self-destruction, decades of smoke-filled rooms in Chinatown and needles in hotel bathrooms, and the slow realization that the image on screen, the hero, the adventurer, the man who feared nothing, was just light and shadow, while the real man was something much smaller, much more frightened, disappearing into drugs that promised escape and delivered only more elaborate prisons. They found his body in the morning. He weighed 165 pounds, down from his prime of 210. His liver was cirrhotic, his heart enlarged, his veins collapsed from injections. He was 50 years old. Captain Blood, Robin Hood, the man who had embodied heroism for millions, had spent his last conscious moments chasing a high that had stopped working years ago, that maybe had never really worked at all, except as a way to briefly forget that behind the smile and the swagger was a man slowly drowning in his own fear. The story you're about to hear is about the man who became synonymous with Dracula and how he ended up sleeping in a coffin, not for publicity, but because he couldn't afford anything else. It reveals what happens when a legitimate injury becomes a lifetime addiction, when a Hungarian immigrant's success turns to poverty, so complete that morphine becomes the only luxury he can still afford. How does Count Dracula himself become a vampire of a different kind, feeding not on blood, but on a drug that slowly drained him of everything? Consider a small apartment in Los Angeles, 1955. The space is shabby, furniture worn beyond repair, wallpaper peeling at the corners. In one corner sits a coffin, not a prop, not a publicity stunt, but an actual coffin that the occupant sleeps in because he sold his bed months ago, and the coffin was a gift from the studio 20 years prior, and it's all he has left. The man who climbs into it each night is 72 years old, gaunt as death itself, his famous Hungarian accent now slurred by drugs and age. This is Bela Lugosi, and he is dying slowly from the inside out. But to understand this moment, we must go back to 1914, to a young Hungarian actor named Bela Ferenc Blasco, fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. The Eastern Front was a nightmare of frozen trenches and artillery barrages, and during one such barrage, shrapnel tore through his left leg and shoulder. The field surgeons did what they could, but battlefield medicine in 1914 consisted largely of amputation or morphine. He was lucky they saved the leg. What they didn't save him from was the morphine they gave him for the pain, week after week in the military hospital, until his body learned to need it the way it needed food and air. He recovered, more or less. The leg never worked quite right afterward, a permanent limp that he'd carry for the rest of his life. But he could walk, could perform, and by 1921 he'd made his way to America, to New York, where he worked in Hungarian theatre for audiences of immigrants who missed the old country. His English was terrible, learned phonetically, each line memorized as sounds rather than meanings. But his presence was magnetic, tall, thin, with eyes that seemed to look through you into some darker place. In 1927, he was cast in a Broadway production of Dracula, The play was a sensation, and Lugosi was its dark heart. His Hungarian accent perfectly suited to the Transylvanian count, his movements precise and predatory. He played the role for a year on Broadway, then again in touring productions, until in 1931, Universal Pictures decided to film it. Lugosi lobbied hard for the role. He'd made it his, after all. But Universal wanted a name actor. Only when those negotiations fell through did they settle on Lugosi, paying him a mere $500 per week for 7 weeks of work. The film made him famous. That entrance, descending the stairs of Castle Dracula, his face emerging from shadow, it became iconic instantly. "I am Dracula," he intones, and 100 million nightmares were born. But fame and fortune are not the same thing, and Lugosi, his English still broken, his accent too thick for romantic leads, found himself trapped in horror roles that paid poorly and offered no prestige. The leg bothered him more as he aged. The old war wound ached constantly, worse in cold weather, worse after long days standing on set. He went to doctors who prescribed morphine, not knowing or not caring about his history with the drug. Perhaps they assumed he could handle it. Perhaps they didn't think about it at all. Morphine was widely prescribed in the 1930s, before anyone fully understood addiction, before the regulations that would come later. Lugosi took it for the pain at first, just for the pain. But morphine is an old friend to those who've known it before, and it welcomed him back with the warmth of a lover. The pain would recede, yes, but more than that, the anxiety would lift. The fear that he'd been typecast, that his career was already over at 50, that his heavy accent meant he'd never play anything but monsters and foreigners, all of that would quiet under morphine's gentle blanket. He increased the doses. Doctors were happy to write prescriptions. When they weren't, there were other sources. Los Angeles had networks for such things. Through the 1930s and 1940s, he worked constantly. Murders in the Rue Morgue, White Zombie, The Raven, Son of Frankenstein. Horror films, always horror films. His Dracula cape becoming a prison he wore in role after role. The pay was terrible, the roles demeaning. He'd beg for better parts, write letters to studios pleading for a chance to show his range. They'd thank him politely and cast him as another vampire, another mad scientist, another monster. The morphine helped him endure it. His colleagues noticed the deterioration. By 1950, Lugosi was showing up to sets unable to remember his lines, his movements sluggish, his famous intensity reduced to a drugged haze. Directors learned to shoot his scenes early in the day, before the morphine really took hold. His eyes, once so hypnotic, now simply looked vacant between takes. The tremor in his hands made holding props difficult. He married 5 times, each marriage shorter than the last. His wives would discover the addiction, try to help, or flee, usually flee. His son, Bela Jr., watched his father's decline with the helpless horror children feel when parents destroy themselves. There were interventions, pleas, threats. Nothing worked. The morphine had him completely by then. By 1955, he was destitute. The horror films had dried up, replaced by a younger generation of monsters. He couldn't pay rent, couldn't afford food. The coffin he slept in was literally all he had left of value. The studio had given it to him after Dracula rapped, thinking it a charming souvenir. Now it was his bed, his connection to the one role that had made him matter, the role that had also trapped and destroyed him. In April 1955, Bela Lugosi did something remarkable. He admitted himself to Metropolitan State Hospital, a psychiatric facility, and publicly announced his morphine addiction. This was 1955, when addiction was seen as moral failure, when admitting such weakness could end a career permanently. But his career was already over, and he was dying, and perhaps some part of him wanted to be honest about it before the end. The hospital detoxified him over several months. It was brutal, sweating, shaking, hallucinating, his body screaming for the drug it had depended on for decades. But he survived it, emerged clean for the first time in 40 years. He gave interviews about his recovery, hoping to help others, hoping perhaps to rebuild some small corner of a demolished career. He managed one final role. Ed Wood, the notorious bad filmmaker, cast him in Plan 9 from Outer Space, a science fiction disaster that has become legendary for its awfulness. Lugosi, 73 and exhausted, sleepwalks through his scenes, his cape from Dracula wrapped around him one last time. The footage is painful to watch. The greatest Dracula reduced to this, working for a director whose incompetence was matched only by his enthusiasm. On August 16, 1956, Bela Lugosi died of a heart attack in his small Los Angeles apartment. He was 73 years old. He'd been clean for a year, had stayed clean to the end. His son arranged for him to be buried in his Dracula cape, the costume that had defined and destroyed him, the only thing of value he'd managed to keep. They buried him at Holy Cross Cemetery. The funeral was small. Hollywood had forgotten him long before his death. But the fans hadn't forgotten, and they came, hundreds of them, to say goodbye to the man who had taught them what fear looked like, who had made them believe in vampires. The irony is almost too neat. The man who played the immortal Count, who drank blood to stay young forever, died old and poor, killed not by a stake through the heart, but by a needle in the arm. The morphine that had started as medicine for a war wound became the addiction that consumed his career, his relationships, his dignity. In the end, Bela Lugosi got his immortality, but not the kind he'd hoped for. He lives on in that first entrance, descending the stairs of Castle Dracula, forever young, forever powerful, forever trapped in the role that gave him everything and took it all away. The story you're about to hear is about an actress so openly addicted to cocaine and bourbon that she'd do lines between takes and dare anyone to stop her. It reveals what happens when addiction becomes performance, when self-destruction is so theatrical that people can't tell where the act ends and the genuine disaster begins. How does a woman who treated her addictions like accessories, worn openly, defiantly, manage to work in Hollywood for decades while others were destroyed for far less? Picture the Warner Brothers Commissary, 1944. Lunchtime. At a corner table sits a woman with a voice like gravel and honey mixed, holding court for a small audience of writers and hangers-on. She's in her early 40s, but looks older, her face showing the effects of too many late nights and too many chemicals. Mid-sentence, she reaches into her purse, pulls out a small silver case, taps out a line of white powder onto the table, the actual table, in the studio commissary where anyone could see, and snorts it through a rolled $100 bill. The writers don't even blink. This is Tallulah, after all. This is what she does. Tallulah Brockman Bankhead was born in 1902 into Alabama aristocracy. Her grandfather and uncle both senators. Her family tree heavy with politicians and judges. She was raised to be a Southern belle, to marry well and host tasteful dinner parties. Instead, she became the most scandalous actress of her generation, a woman who seemed constitutionally incapable of discretion or shame. She arrived in New York at 15, determined to act, and by 18 was working steadily on Broadway. But it was London that made her a star. From 1923 to 1930, she conquered the West End, playing everything from Shakespeare to contemporary drama, accumulating lovers of both sexes with a democratic enthusiasm that shocked even jaded Londoners. And it was in London that she discovered cocaine, introduced by a writer whose name she'd never remember, but whose gift she'd never forget. The cocaine in the 1920s was pure, cheap, and everywhere in theatrical circles. It sharpened performance, killed appetite, provided energy for the exhausting schedule of stage work. Tallulah took to it immediately, the way some people take to religion. It matched her personality, fast, sharp, dangerous, unapologetic. She'd show up to parties with it openly, offer it to strangers, do lines off mantelpieces and coffee tables while discussing Ibsen or last night's performance. Her friends found it charming, or at least they said they did. Tallulah had the kind of charisma that made her transgressions seem like privileges. She returned to America in 1901, her reputation preceding her, and Hollywood tried to figure out what to do with her. She was talented, certainly, but difficult to cast. Her voice was too distinctive, too raspy, the result of smoking 5 packs of cigarettes daily since age 15, her vocal cords scraped raw by tobacco and late nights. She looked more interesting than beautiful, her face all angles and attitude, and she was frank about sex in ways that made studio executives nervous. But she could act, and occasionally they'd find roles that suited her particular intensity. The Devil and the Deep in 1932, Lifeboat for Hitchcock in 1944. She was extraordinary in the right part, bringing an edge that other actresses couldn't match. The problem was maintaining any kind of professionalism when she was high more often than not, when she'd show up to set with pupils like pinpoints or dilated to black, depending on what combination of substances she'd consumed that morning. The bourbon came with the cocaine, the way it often does. Cocaine makes you jittery, paranoid, your heart racing and your thoughts spinning. Alcohol smooths those edges, brings you down just enough to function. She'd start drinking at noon, sometimes earlier, bourbon neat in a flask she carried everywhere. By evening, she'd be on her 3rd or 4th drink. By midnight, perhaps her 10th. The combination should have killed her, the stimulant and depressant fighting for control of her system. Instead, it seemed to fuel her, some strange alchemy of constitution and chemicals that kept her upright when others would have collapsed. The cigarettes were their own addiction, separate but intertwined. 5 packs daily, sometimes 6, 120 cigarettes. each one another small burn to her throat and lungs. She'd light one from the butt of another, an endless chain of smoke that followed her everywhere. The voice that resulted was extraordinary, that famous rasp that could purr or growl, seduce or intimidate. But it was also the sound of tissue damage, of cells mutating, of lungs slowly drowning in tar. Her colleagues learned to work around her addictions the way you'd work around a star's particular lighting requirements or preferred camera angles. Tallulah needed cocaine before emotional scenes, needed bourbon to relax between takes, needed cigarettes constantly, or she'd become irritable. Directors scheduled shoots accordingly. Her co-stars learned not to be surprised by anything, not the flask at breakfast, not the powder in her dressing room, not the string of lovers she'd parade through in varying states of undress. What's remarkable is that she worked at all, that her career lasted decades despite behavior that would have ended lesser talents immediately. Part of it was her skill. When she was on, she was extraordinary, bringing a lived-in quality to roles that other actresses could only approximate. But part of it was her absolute refusal to apologize or hide. She made her addictions part of her persona, the Tallulah show that people paid to see. The cocaine wasn't a secret. It was a character trait. The drinking wasn't a problem. It was a lifestyle choice. And somehow, that brazenness protected her in ways that secrecy never could have. She was frank about sex, too, in an era when such frankness could destroy careers. She'd had affairs with women, with men, sometimes with both simultaneously. She spoke about orgasms at dinner parties, propositioned strangers at premieres, answered questions about her love life with a candor that made gossip columnists simultaneously scandalized and delighted. The studios tried to rein her in, had meetings where they'd explain the morality clauses in her contracts. She'd nod politely, then do exactly as she pleased. By the 1950s, the roles had largely dried up. She was in her 50s, and Hollywood had never been kind to aging women, even talented ones. She worked in television occasionally, did stage work when it was offered, but mostly she held court at parties, telling outrageous stories about the old days, still drinking, still smoking, still doing cocaine when she could afford it or when someone would provide it. Her health deteriorated predictably. The cigarettes gave her emphysema, made breathing a struggle. The bourbon ravaged her liver. The cocaine weakened her heart. By the 1960s, she was frequently hospitalized, her body simply unable to sustain the abuse she'd subjected it to for 40 years. But she never quit, never even pretended to try. Quitting would have meant admitting that the lifestyle had been a mistake, and Tallulah Bankhead admitted nothing. She died on December 12, 1968, in New York, of pneumonia and emphysema. She was 66 years old, though she looked and felt 90. Her lungs were destroyed, her liver cirrhotic, her heart enlarged. The autopsy was a catalogue of damage, each organ bearing witness to decades of systematic abuse. They held a memorial service at St. Bartholomew's Church. The theatre community came, along with journalists and fans and various people who'd been scandalized by her over the years, but I had to admit, she'd been magnificent. They told stories about her outrageousness, her talent, her impossible charisma. Most of the stories involved drinking or drugs or sex, because those were the stories Tallulah had chosen to write with her life. What they didn't talk about much was the cost, the roles she might have played if she'd been more reliable, the relationships that couldn't survive her addictions, the quiet moments when the performance dropped and there was just a woman alone, needing chemicals to feel normal because normal had become impossible years ago. Tallulah made her addictions look like choices, like rebellion, like freedom. And perhaps they were, at first. But by the end, they were just the bars of a cage she'd built herself. One line and one drink and one cigarette at a time, until there was no Tallulah left outside of them. The performance had consumed the performer, and what remained was smoke and mirrors and a voice like gravel, still defiant, still unapologetic, even as it whispered its last. The story you're about to hear is about a Nobel Prize winner who came to Hollywood and stayed drunk for years, writing scripts in alcoholic hazes that terrified studio executives. It reveals what happens when literary genius collides with the machinery of Hollywood, when a man uses alcohol not just to cope, but to create, until he can no longer tell the difference between inspiration and intoxication. Consider the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lot in Culver City, 1932. In a cramped writer's bungalow, a small man with a mustache sits hunched over a typewriter, a bottle of bourbon on the desk beside him, another in the drawer, a third hidden behind the filing cabinet. His fingers move across the keys with surprising speed, considering how much he's had to drink. Half a bottle since breakfast, though it's hard to say for certain because he's been refilling the glass from different bottles, a shell game he plays with himself to avoid counting. This is William Faulkner, already the author of The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, already one of the greatest writers in American literature, working as a contract writer for a studio that pays him $500 a week and treats him like a moderately competent typist. William Cuthbert Faulkner was born in Mississippi in 1897 into a family that had once been prominent but was sliding steadily into genteel poverty. He started drinking young, the way Southern men of a certain class did, bourbon being as much a part of the culture as humidity and complicated family histories. But with Faulkner, the drinking was never social, never moderate. Even in his 20s, he'd disappear on benders that lasted days, returning gaunt and shaking, unable to explain where he'd been or what he'd done. He came to Hollywood the first time in 1932 because he needed money. His novels sold poorly. The Sound and the Fury moved fewer than 2,000 copies in its first year, and he had a wife and stepdaughter to support, a large house to maintain, a lifestyle that required income his art couldn't provide. So he went west, took the studio contract, and discovered that Hollywood had more bourbon than Mississippi and fewer people who cared if you drank it. MGM put him to work on various projects, most of which never reached the screen. The studio system didn't know what to do with a literary genius. They wanted competent dialogue and plot mechanics, not the stream of consciousness experimentation that made Faulkner's novels masterpieces. So he drank and typed and drank, producing pages that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes incoherent, depending on which bottle he was working from. His colleagues noticed immediately. Other writers in the bungalows heard the bottles clinking, smelled the bourbon seeping through the walls. Directors learned that Faulkner was most useful in the mornings, before the drinking really took hold. Though even then, he'd usually had several drinks to steady his hands. By afternoon, he'd be useless, slurring his words during story conferences, sometimes falling asleep mid-sentence. The studio kept him anyway, renewing his contract year after year, because occasionally, when the alcohol hit just right, he'd produce something extraordinary. He worked uncredited on scripts that became classics. Today We Live, To Have and Have Not, The Big Sleep. Howard Hawks, the director, learned how to manage him, would call Faulkner to his office at 9 in the morning before the drinking got too heavy, and they'd work through scenes together. Hawks kept bourbon in his desk, would pour for both of them, a drink between colleagues, though Hawks sipped while Faulkner drained glass after glass. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but repeated often enough to have the weight of truth, about Faulkner asking Hawks if he could work from home. Hawks agreed, assuming he meant his hotel. Faulkner disappeared. Days passed, then weeks. The studio panicked, sent people looking. They finally found him in Mississippi, drunk in his own house, having interpreted home literally. He'd been drinking the entire time, barely writing, just sitting on his porch with a bottle, watching the South he'd chronicled so brilliantly in his novels. The pattern repeated throughout the 30s and 40s. Faulkner would come to Hollywood for the money, work until the drinking made him useless, disappear on a bender that might last days or weeks, eventually resurface, dry out slightly, and begin again. The studio kept paying him because talent, even unreliable talent, was valuable. And Faulkner needed the money because his novels, the work that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize, barely sold. The binges were spectacular in their self-destruction. He'd start drinking in the morning and continue through the night, bottle after bottle, until he'd pass out wherever he happened to be. His bungalow, a bar, once in the studio commissary. He'd wake up hours later, still drunk, and continue. Food became optional during these episodes. Sleep was whatever happened between bottles. His weight would drop. His hands shake so badly he couldn't light cigarettes. His face take on the grey pallor of severe alcoholism. His wife Estelle, back in Mississippi, received telegrams from the studio asking her to come get him again. She'd make the trip west, find him in whatever state he'd achieved, and somehow get him back to Oxford, where he'd dry out in their bedroom, sweating and hallucinating, seeing things that probably weren't much worse than the things he'd written about. Then he'd recover, write another novel that nobody bought, and eventually the money would run out, and he'd have to go back to Hollywood. The drinking accelerated through the 1940s. By then, Faulkner was in his 50s, his body showing the cumulative damage of decades of abuse. His liver was struggling, his heart irregular, his hands developing a permanent tremor. Doctors warned him repeatedly that he was killing himself. He'd nod, agree, promise to cut back, then be drunk again within hours. In 1945, he worked on the script for The Big Sleep, adapting Raymond Chandler's novel with Hawks directing. The screenplay is brilliant, full of snappy dialogue and complicated plotting. Faulkner wrote much of it drunk, typing with one hand while holding a glass with the other. The film became a classic. Faulkner barely remembered working on it. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, a recognition that came decades late, but came nonetheless. He was 52 years old, already an alcoholic of such severity that the trip to Stockholm to accept the prize was planned around his drinking schedule. He stayed sober for the ceremony, gave a speech about the writer's duty that became famous, then celebrated by getting catastrophically drunk for 3 days straight. Hollywood kept calling him back through the 1950s, kept offering contracts he couldn't refuse because he still needed money. His novels were being rediscovered, scholars recognizing his genius. But that recognition didn't translate to sales. So he'd come west, drink, write pages that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes unusable, and eventually return to Mississippi to recover. On July 6, 1962, William Faulkner died at a hospital in Oxford, Mississippi. The official cause was a heart attack, though his liver was cirrhotic, his kidneys failing, his entire system compromised by alcohol. He was 64 years old. He'd been drinking heavily the night before, had fallen from a horse earlier that week. He'd taken up riding late in life, would ride while drunk, which ended predictably. They buried him in the family plot, the writer who'd chronicled the South's decline while drinking himself into the same kind of ruin he'd described so perfectly on the page. His Hollywood work remains, scattered through credits and uncredited rewrites. The novels remain too, the ones he wrote between bottles, the ones that made him immortal despite the poison he poured into himself year after year. The bourbon won, in the end, the way it usually does. But it didn't win easily, and it didn't win without Faulkner leaving behind words that would outlast the damage, that would speak long after the last bottle was empty. The story you're about to hear is about a man who made millions laugh while eating himself into pain, consuming thousands of calories daily to fill a void that no amount of food could ever satisfy. It reveals what happens when childhood trauma transforms into adult compulsion, when the thing that comforts you slowly becomes the thing that destroys you. How does the most famous fat man in America become a prisoner of his own appetite? Picture the Alexandria Hotel in Los Angeles, 1921. In a suite on the 4th floor, a round man sits surrounded by the remains of an enormous meal. 3 steaks, a dozen eggs, 2 loaves of bread, a cake, various sides, all consumed in a single sitting. His stomach aches, stretched beyond comfort. But he's already thinking about what he'll eat next. What meal might finally satisfy the hunger that has nothing to do with his stomach. This is Roscoe Arbuckle, known to the world as Fatty, the second biggest star in silent comedy after Charlie Chaplin. In a few days, a party in San Francisco will destroy his career and his life. But the real destruction started decades earlier, in a childhood home where food became the only reliable source of comfort. Roscoe Conkling Arbuckle was born in 1887 in Kansas, a large baby who became a large child in a family that saw his size as evidence of moral weakness. His father, a stern man who believed obesity was a character flaw, would withhold meals as punishment, then watch as young Roscoe snuck food from the pantry in the middle of the night. The pattern established itself early: deprivation followed by secret binging, shame followed by comfort eating, a cycle that would define his relationship with food for his entire life. He was performing by age 8, singing in amateur shows, his size making him a natural comedian. People laughed at fat children, found something inherently funny about roundness and clumsiness, and Roscoe learned to use this to make his weight part of the performance. By his teens, he was working professionally, doing comedy bits where he'd pretend to be light as a feather, would leap and dance with surprising grace for a man his size. The audience loved it. The fat man who moved like a dancer was comedy gold. But offstage, the eating continued and accelerated. By his 20s, Arbuckle was consuming an estimated 10,000 calories daily. Breakfast might be a dozen eggs, a pound of bacon, a stack of pancakes with butter and syrup. Lunch was multiple entrees. Whatever restaurant he was near serving portions sized for several people that he'd finish alone. Dinner was worse. Elaborate meals that started with appetizers and continued through multiple courses, everything washed down with cream and butter and sauces designed to add richness to already rich foods. He came to Hollywood in 1913 and became a star almost immediately. Mack Sennett signed him to Keystone Studios, where Arbuckle made dozens of short comedies, his size and athleticism creating a unique screen presence. He could take pratfalls that would injure smaller men, could absorb impacts and bounce back, his body both his trademark and his shield. By 1918, he was making $3,000 a week, an astronomical sum, and using much of it to fund his eating. His friends knew about the addiction, called it his problem in the careful way people had before therapy and diagnosis. They'd watch him eat entire meals meant for parties, would find him in his dressing room, surrounded by empty dishes and wrappers, would notice how he'd disappear between takes to eat privately, away from judgment. The studio didn't care as long as he could perform, and perform he did, making film after film, each one featuring the lovable fat man who couldn't be kept down. But the eating was taking its toll. By 30, Arbuckle suffered from chronic indigestion, his stomach perpetually distended, his joints aching from carrying 300 pounds. He developed sleep apnea, would stop breathing during the night, wake gasping and terrified. His blood pressure was dangerously high, his heart struggling to pump blood through the excess flesh. Doctors warned him repeatedly, told him he'd die young if he didn't lose weight. He'd nod, promise to try, then eat an enormous meal on the drive home. The weight made everything harder. Moving on set became laborious, his knees protesting every jump and fall. The athleticism that had made him special was disappearing under layers of fat. Directors had to frame shots carefully to minimize his size, though that was becoming impossible. He was, by 1921, pushing 350 pounds, his body a testament to decades of compulsive consumption. Then came Labor Day weekend, 1921. Arbuckle threw a party in San Francisco, a celebration in a hotel suite with bootleg gin and several women. What happened next remains disputed. Accusations were made. A woman named Virginia Rappi became ill and later died, and Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter. 3 trials followed, the first 2 ending in hung juries, the third in acquittal with an unprecedented apology from the jury for the injustice done to him. But Hollywood didn't care about acquittal. The scandal was too big, the details too sordid, and Arbuckle's weight made him an easy villain. The fat man attacking an innocent woman. It fit too perfectly with existing prejudices about obesity and self-control and moral character. His films were pulled from theaters. His contracts were cancelled. The most beloved comedian in America became unemployable overnight. The eating worsened. Stress and depression drove him further into the addiction, food becoming the only comfort in a life that had collapsed completely. He'd order multiple meals delivered to his home, eat them all in darkness, ashamed but unable to stop. His weight ballooned past 400 pounds, his body beginning to fail in earnest. His heart was enlarged, struggling to function. His liver showed signs of fatty degeneration. His knees could barely support him. He tried to work under a pseudonym, directing films as William Goodrich. Some knew who he was, most didn't care, but the work was sporadic and paid little. The money from his glory days disappeared, spent on medical bills and legal fees and food, always food. He'd eat to forget the lost career, eat to numb the shame, eat because eating was the one thing he'd always been able to control, even as that control revealed itself as its opposite. By the late 1920s, there were signs of a comeback. The scandal had faded enough that some theaters were willing to show his old films again, and he got offers to appear in talking pictures. He lost weight for these roles, doctors supervising his diet, his first real attempt at recovery. He got down to 250 pounds, looked almost healthy, and signed a contract with Warner Brothers for a series of comedy shorts. On June 29, 1933, Roscoe Arbuckle died in his sleep at a New York hotel. He'd just finished filming his first talking short, had celebrated that evening with a party. The official cause was a heart attack, though it was really the cumulative damage of decades of obesity, the strain on a heart that had worked too hard for too long. He was 46 years old. In his room, they found evidence of a late-night meal, sandwiches and cake, one last binge before sleep. They buried him quietly, the scandal still clinging to his name despite the acquittal, the fat man forever guilty in public imagination. His films remained banned for years, a career erased by moral panic and a scandal he didn't cause. But the food addiction, the real story of his life, remained mostly unexamined. He was fat, people thought, because he lacked willpower, because he was greedy, because something in him was fundamentally weak. The possibility that he was addicted, that food had been both his comfort and his prison since childhood, that he'd eaten himself to death in increments over decades, that understanding would come later, too late for Arbuckle, too late to save a man who fed his pain until there was nothing left but the pain itself. The story you're about to hear is about the German goddess who maintained her figure through decades with doctor-prescribed speed, eventually taking it not for weight, but because she couldn't function without it. It reveals what happens when vanity becomes medical necessity, when the pills that keep you thin become the only thing keeping you alive. How does eternal youth become a prison built from amphetamines and mirrors? Picture a dressing room at the Café de Paris in London, 1954. A woman in her early 50s sits before a mirror, lit by bulbs so bright they hurt to look at. Every flaw is visible under this light, every line, every shadow, every sign of age. She's been staring at herself for 20 minutes, cataloguing imperfections invisible to anyone else. On the table beside her, a small leather case contains what she needs: amphetamine tablets, pharmaceutical grade, prescribed by Dr. Max Jacobson in New York. She takes 3, more than her usual dose, because tonight she needs to be perfect. This is Marlene Dietrich, and she has been taking speed to stay thin since 1930, and by now she cannot remember what it feels like to exist without the chemical burning through her veins. Maria Magdalena Dietrich was born in Berlin in 1901 into a family that valued discipline and appearance above almost everything. Her mother was severe, critical, a woman who measured her daughter's worth in visible perfection. Young Marlene learned early that love was conditional on beauty, on maintaining standards, on never letting anyone see you as less than immaculate. She came to Hollywood in 1930, brought by Joseph von Sternberg, who'd seen her in The Blue Angel and recognized something extraordinary. Paramount put her under contract and immediately set about transforming her. She was beautiful but needed to be thinner, they said, her face more angular, her body more sculptural. The studio doctor provided a solution: Benzedrine, a new wonder drug that killed appetite and provided energy. 2 pills in the morning, maybe another at lunch, and suddenly food became optional and excess weight simply melted away. The amphetamines worked perfectly. Dietrich's weight dropped from 135 to 118 pounds, her face becoming the mask of planes and shadows that photographers adored. Her energy in those early Hollywood years seemed supernatural. She'd work 16-hour days without flagging, perform take after take with undiminished intensity, attend premieres and parties late into the night, then be on set at dawn looking flawless. The pills made it all possible. But she didn't stop when the weight stabilized. The amphetamines had become necessary in ways beyond appetite suppression. They provided confidence, sharpness, the ability to perform under constant scrutiny. Without them, she felt slow, heavy, inadequate. So she kept taking them, year after year, the dosage creeping upward as her body adapted and required more to achieve the same effect. By the late 1930s, Dietrich was taking amphetamines daily, prescribed by a succession of doctors who either didn't know or didn't care about addiction. She'd found Dr. Max Jacobson in New York, the man celebrities called Dr. Feelgood, who gave injections he claimed were vitamin B12, but actually contained methamphetamine. She became a regular patient, visiting whenever she was in New York, always leaving with that familiar burning energy, the sense that she could accomplish anything. Her colleagues noticed the signs, the way her eyes glittered slightly too bright in certain lights, how she'd talk rapidly between takes, subjects jumping without transition, the occasional tremor in her hands when the dosage wore off. Her perfectionism, always present, became obsessive under amphetamine influence. She'd demand retakes for reasons no one else could detect, would adjust her appearance endlessly, seeing flaws that existed only in her chemically altered perception. The pills allowed her to maintain an image of agelessness that seemed almost supernatural. Through her 40s and 50s, Dietrich appeared barely to age. Her weight never fluctuated, her energy never flagged. She performed in nightclubs, wearing dresses so tight they had to be sewn onto her body. executing routines that would exhaust women half her age. The audience saw magic. They didn't see the amphetamines, the hours of preparation, the absolute discipline required to maintain the illusion. But the cost was accumulating invisibly. Amphetamines strain the cardiovascular system, increase blood pressure, make the heart work harder with each beat. They disrupt sleep patterns, requiring sleeping pills to counteract their effects, creating a cycle of uppers and downers that few bodies can sustain indefinitely. Dietrich's moods became erratic, periods of manic productivity, followed by crashes into depression when she tried to cut back or couldn't get her medication. Her relationships suffered. She was never easy, her perfectionism extending to everyone around her. But the amphetamines made her harsher, more critical, less able to tolerate perceived imperfection. Her daughter Maria wrote later about the difficulty of having Marlene as a mother, the exacting standards, the volatility, the sense that love was contingent on meeting impossible expectations. The pills didn't create these tendencies, but they amplified them, turned demanding into tyrannical. By the 1960s, Dietrich was in her 60s, but still taking amphetamines daily, still maintaining the weight and energy of someone decades younger. The medical establishment was beginning to understand addiction, was pulling back on prescriptions, but she had sources, doctors who'd write what she needed. She couldn't stop because stopping meant aging, meant becoming ordinary, meant admitting that the goddess image had always required chemical assistance. The performing continued into her 70s. She'd appear on stage in her sequin dress, lit carefully to hide what lighting could hide, and she'd sing in that voice made husky by decades of cigarettes and strain. The audience would applaud the miracle of Marlene Dietrich at 70, looking 50. They didn't know about the amphetamines backstage, the pills she'd take before performances, the way her hands shook when the dose wore off. In 1975, she fell during a performance in Sydney, breaking her leg. The injury effectively ended her stage career. She was 73 and her body could no longer sustain the punishment she'd subjected it to for decades. She retreated to her Paris apartment and became increasingly reclusive, seeing almost no one, communicating mainly by telephone. The amphetamines continued even in isolation. She took them not for weight anymore, she barely ate, but because not taking them meant facing withdrawal, meant experiencing her body and mind without chemical assistance for the first time in 50 years. That prospect terrified her more than aging, more than dying. On May the 6th, 1992, Marlene Dietrich died in her Paris apartment. She was 90 years old, though only her closest associates knew she'd lived that long. She'd maintained the fiction of agelessness to the end, giving her birth year as 1904 instead of 1901. Her body was emaciated, her organs damaged by decades of stimulant abuse. The autopsy revealed a heart enlarged by strain, blood vessels weakened by years of elevated blood pressure. They buried her in Berlin, the city she'd left 60 years earlier. Thousands attended, mourning the goddess, the eternal image of beauty and sophistication. Few of them knew the price of that image, the daily amphetamines that had allowed her to seem ageless, the addiction that had started as vanity and ended as necessity. She'd taken her last dose the night she died, maintaining the discipline to the very end, unable to imagine existing without the chemical that had defined her for most of her life. The beauty had been real, the talent undeniable, but so was the cost, measured in pills and decades, in a life spent outrunning age, until age finally, inevitably, caught up. The story you're about to hear is about the most beautiful man in pictures becoming addicted to painkillers after his car crash, mixing them with alcohol in a combination that visibly transformed him on screen. It reveals what happens when physical pain becomes the excuse for an addiction that was really about something else entirely, something that hurt long before the accident. How does a face, that perfect, become a mask for self-destruction? Picture a narrow road in Benedict Canyon, May 12, 1956, just after midnight. A car driven by a 25-year-old actor leaves a party at Elizabeth Taylor's house, winds through the dark canyon roads, and suddenly loses control. The car hits a telephone pole head-on, the impact so severe that the steering wheel is driven into the driver's face, shattering bones, breaking teeth, nearly tearing his face from his skull. This is Montgomery Clift, and although he will survive this accident, the man who existed before this moment will not. The Demerol they give him for the pain will see to that. Edward Montgomery Clift was born in 1920 into a family that specialized in pretense. His mother claimed aristocratic European lineage that likely didn't exist, raised her children to believe they were superior to common people, better bred, destined for greatness. Monty, as he was called, was beautiful from childhood, an almost feminine beauty that made him simultaneously desirable and suspect in a culture that valued masculine ruggedness. He came to Hollywood in 1948, already a successful stage actor, and his first film was Red River with John Wayne. The contrast between them was deliberate. Wayne's weathered masculinity versus Clift's sensitive beauty. Both were compelling, but Clift represented something new in American cinema, a vulnerability that previous leading men had avoided. He was method before method became dominant, bringing psychological depth to roles that had previously been pure surfaces. The drinking started early, though no one called it alcoholism because functional alcoholism was simply how Hollywood worked. He'd have drinks before auditions to calm his nerves, drinks after performances to come down from the intensity. His friends knew he was gay, an open secret in certain circles, and knew that this secret required constant vigilance in an era when such things could destroy careers. The alcohol helped with that anxiety, made the closet slightly more bearable. But he was brilliant. A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity. Films where his beauty and talent combined into something almost unbearable to watch. There was a sensitivity in his performances that felt raw, unprotected, as if he'd stripped away some essential barrier that other actors kept intact. Audiences and critics responded with near worship. Montgomery Clift at 35 was arguably the finest actor in American cinema, and certainly the most beautiful. Then came the accident. Leaving Elizabeth Taylor's party, drunk. He was always somewhat drunk by then. He lost control on a curve he'd navigated hundreds of times. The impact shattered his face so completely that when Taylor arrived at the wreck moments later, she had to reach into his throat to pull out teeth he'd swallowed to keep him from choking. The ambulance took him to a hospital where doctors worked for hours to reconstruct a face that had been, minutes earlier, the most famous face in America. They gave him Demerol for the pain. Demerol, a synthetic opioid, powerful and effective, and he needed it because the pain was extraordinary. His jaw was broken in 4 places. His nose was crushed. His cheekbone shattered. The reconstructive surgery was extensive, and the recovery was agony. Months of pain so severe that the Demerol seemed not like addiction, but like mercy. But Demerol is patient, and pain is an excellent excuse. The physical pain eventually healed, more or less, though his face was changed in ways both subtle and obvious. The perfect symmetry was gone, replaced by a slight slackness, a quality that made him look older, sadder, damaged. But the emotional pain, the thing he'd been medicating with alcohol for years, that remained. And now he had something more effective than alcohol, something that didn't just dull the pain, but erased it entirely. He returned to work in 1957, filming Raintree County with Elizabeth Taylor, who felt responsible for the accident since he'd been leaving her party. Watching him on screen, you can see the difference. The beauty is still there, but distorted. His face not quite symmetrical anymore, his movements slightly off. And something else. His eyes have a glassiness that wasn't there before, the look of someone perpetually medicated. The Demerol consumption increased steadily. He'd take pills before filming to manage anxiety, during breaks to maintain the pleasant numbness, after work to sleep. His doctors prescribed them readily. He had legitimate pain, legitimate surgeries, a legitimate need. That the need had become addiction was something everyone pretended not to notice. His performances in the late 50s and early 60s show the progression. In Suddenly, last summer, he's bloated, his speech slightly slurred, his movements careful in the way of people who aren't entirely sure where their body is in space. In The Misfits, his final film with living screen legends, he's visibly struggling, forgetting lines, needing multiple takes for simple scenes. His co-stars watched with sympathy and horror as the most talented actor of his generation disintegrated before their eyes. The alcohol never stopped. He'd mix it with Demerol, despite knowing, everyone told him, that the combination could kill him. Maybe that was part of the appeal. He'd become increasingly reckless, showing up to sets high or drunk or both, burning bridges with directors who'd once begged to work with him. His reputation went from brilliant to difficult to unemployable. His friends tried interventions. Elizabeth Taylor, who loved him deeply, begged him to get help. He'd promised to try, would check into hospitals for detox, but within days or weeks, he'd be using again. The addiction had its hooks too deep by then. And besides, what was he supposed to do with the pain that wasn't physical? The pain of being closeted and beautiful and aging and damaged all at once. By the mid-60s, he was barely working. The roles that came were smaller, less prestigious, often in films that went straight to television. His appearance had deteriorated significantly. The face that had launched 1,000 dreams now puffy and grey, his body thin in unhealthy ways, his eyes perpetually glazed. He looked 60, though he was barely 45. On July 23, 1966, Montgomery Clift died in his New York townhouse. His secretary found him lying in bed, wearing glasses, apparently having died reading. The official cause was a heart attack, though it was really everything. The years of Demerol and alcohol, the damaged heart, the liver that had processed too many toxins for too long. He was 45 years old. They found Demerol and various other medications throughout his house, bottles in every room, prescriptions from multiple doctors. His tolerance had become so high by the end that the doses that killed him would have been barely recreational for his damaged system. His heart simply gave up, exhausted from years of chemical strain. The funeral was small. Hollywood had largely forgotten him by then, the brilliant young actor who'd burned so bright and so briefly. Elizabeth Taylor attended, weeping openly, mourning the friend she'd loved and couldn't save. The man who'd been the most beautiful face in cinema was buried with that face barely recognizable, transformed by painkillers and time and a pain that no drug could ever adequately address. The accident hadn't made him an addict. The addiction was already forming, the self-medication already in progress. But the accident gave him permission, gave him a legitimate reason to take drugs that did what he needed them to do, which was make him feel nothing at all. And in the end, that's exactly what he achieved. Nothing. Blank peace. His heart stopping in a quiet room on a summer night. The pills finally doing what they'd promised all along. The story you're about to hear is about a rising star who threw it all away for heroin, ending up trading sex for drugs on Hollywood Boulevard. Unrecognizable from the woman who dated Howard Hughes, it reveals how quickly everything can collapse when addiction takes hold, how a few years of heroin can erase decades of ambition and beauty. How does a girl who had everything become a woman with nothing but a needle and a corner? Picture the intersection of Hollywood Boulevard and Cahuenga, 1963. It's past midnight, the tourist crowd's gone, leaving only the night people, dealers, addicts, prostitutes, the human debris of a city that produces stars and discards them with equal efficiency. A woman leans against a storefront, wearing clothes that might have been fashionable 5 years ago, but now hang loose on her frame. Her makeup is thick, attempting to cover track marks and bruises and the grey cast of her skin. She's 39 years old, but looks 60. Men slow their cars, some recognizing her, most just seeing another junkie prostitute. This is Barbara Payton, who 7 years earlier was a rising starlet dating the most powerful men in Hollywood. The heroin has taken everything else. Now it's taking the last thing she has left to sell. Barbara Lee Redfield was born in 1927 in Cloquet, Minnesota. Beautiful from childhood in that particular American way that suggests both innocence and availability. She was married at 16, divorced at 17, married again at 18. The marriages were practice for what she really wanted, which was Hollywood, which was fame, which was the kind of attention that would prove she was special. She arrived in Los Angeles in 1948, 21 years old, with the kind of looks that opened doors immediately. Within a year, she had a contract with Universal, small roles that showed promise, the trajectory pointing upward. She was blonde and curvy and photographed well, had that quality of seeming always slightly available, which Hollywood valued in its starlets. By 1949, she was dating Howard Hughes, the billionaire who collected beautiful women like some men collected cars. But Barbara wanted more than to be collected. She wanted to be a star, and she had the work ethic for it, taking acting lessons, showing up on time, doing everything the studio asked. In 1950, she was cast in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye opposite James Cagney, a significant role that suggested she might actually make it. The film was successful, Payton was noticed, and suddenly she was dating Franchot Tone, the distinguished actor 20 years her senior who'd been married to Joan Crawford. Then she met Tom Neal, a B-movie actor with a violent streak, and everything accelerated toward disaster. She was engaged to Tone, but sleeping with Neal, playing them against each other with a recklessness that suggests she understood, on some level, that she was sabotaging herself. In September 1951, Neal and Tone fought over her, literally fought. And Neal beat Tone so severely that Tone spent weeks in the hospital and came out with permanent damage. The scandal destroyed her career. The studios didn't care who was right or wrong. They cared that Payton was tabloid poison, generating headlines about sex and violence when they wanted their starlets generating headlines about upcoming films. Her contract wasn't renewed. The good roles stopped coming. By 1952, she was doing B-movies for Poverty Row Studios, her trajectory pointing sharply downward. This is when the heroine appeared, introduced at a party by someone whose name she'd later claim not to remember, though whether she truly forgot or simply didn't want to say is impossible to determine. Heroin was readily available in early 1950s Hollywood, trafficked through networks connected to organized crime, sold to people who had money and poor judgment. Payton had both. The first injection was euphoria, a warmth that spread through her body and erased everything. The ruined career, the scandal, the dawning realization that she'd destroyed her own chances. For a few hours, none of it mattered. She was perfect, complete, loved by the universe in a way she'd never felt before. That feeling, that brief perfect moment, was worth chasing forever. Within months, she was using daily, the doses increasing as her tolerance built. Heroin is expensive, especially at the doses addicts require, and her money was disappearing. The B-movies stopped calling. She sold her jewelry, her furniture, her car. She borrowed from friends until they stopped answering her calls. She moved to cheaper apartments, then to rooms, then to places that barely qualified as shelter. By 1955, she was prostituting regularly, trading sex for drug money, working the same Hollywood boulevard where she'd once attended premieres. The heroine had destroyed her looks with remarkable efficiency. The beauty that had opened every door now collapsed into gauntness and bad skin and the glassy-eyed stare of chronic addiction. But some men still recognized her, still wanted to sleep with the fallen starlet, found something appealing in her degradation. She tried to quit periodically, checking herself into hospitals or fleeing to her parents' house in Minnesota. But withdrawal was agony and sobriety was worse. Without heroin, she had to face what she'd become, and that was unbearable. She'd last days or weeks before using again, each relapse dropping her lower. The prostitution became more dangerous, less selective. She'd get into cars with anyone who had money, service them in alleys or cheap hotels, sometimes getting beaten, sometimes getting paid, always getting high after. There were arrests for prostitution, for possession, for various survival crimes. She'd spend nights in jail, be released, immediately find a fix. The cycle was relentless. The woman who dated Howard Hughes was now giving $5 blowjobs in parked cars, the heroin having reduced her worth to whatever a desperate junkie could command. In 1963, she published an autobiography, I Am Not Ashamed, a raw account of her descent that attempted honesty about her addiction and prostitution. The book sold modestly, gave her enough money for a few months of relative stability. Then that money was gone too, converted to heroin and injected into increasingly damaged veins. She tried to maintain contact with her son from her first marriage, but addiction made her unreliable, dangerous to be around. He was a teenager by then, old enough to understand what his mother had become, old enough to protect himself by keeping distance. She'd call him sometimes, crying, promising she'd get clean, promising she'd be the mother he deserved. She never managed it. By 1967, Barbara Payton was dying. The years of heroin and prostitution and malnutrition had destroyed her body. Her liver was failing, her heart damaged, her veins so collapsed that finding injection sites required increasingly creative and dangerous methods. She was living in a single room, selling sex when she could, stealing when she couldn't, always chasing the high that no longer worked the way it once had. On May 8, 1967, Barbara Payton died of heart and liver failure in San Diego. She was 39 years old. Her parents claimed her body, buried her quietly in Minnesota, far from Hollywood, far from the streets where she'd spent her final years. The obituaries were brief, mentioning Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye and the scandal with Tone and Neil, glossing quickly over the last 15 years because nobody wanted to dwell on how completely she'd destroyed herself. From Howard Hughes to Hollywood Boulevard took less than a decade. The heroin didn't cause all of it. Her self-destructive impulses predated the drug. Her talent was limited, her choices consistently terrible. But the heroin accelerated everything, took a career decline and turned it into a death spiral. It promised relief and delivered only more need, turned a beautiful woman into a junkie prostitute, and eventually killed her in a rented room far from the lights she'd once thought were meant for her. The story you're about to hear is about America's sultry pinup, drinking a bottle of vodka daily by her 30s, spiraling from A-list to working as a barmaid in a Manhattan hotel. It reveals what happens when the image that makes you famous becomes a prison, when the hair that hides one eye hides something much darker underneath. How does the face that sold war bonds end up serving drinks to men who don't recognize her? Picture the Martha Washington Hotel in New York City, 1962. Behind the bar, a woman in her early 40s pours drinks with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the tremor that starts around noon. She's gained weight, her famous figure thickened by years of alcohol, her face puffy and lined. Most customers don't recognize her, and she prefers it that way. Occasionally, someone squints, trying to place her, and she'll turn away, letting her hair fall across her face in a gesture that was once iconic. This is Veronica Lake, who a decade earlier was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, whose peekaboo hairstyle was copied by millions. The vodka bottle in her purse is nearly empty. She'll refill it after her shift. She was born Constance Frances Marie Ockelman in 1922 in Brooklyn, a girl who wanted desperately to be anywhere else. She changed her name multiple times before landing on Veronica Lake, a name that sounded cool and remote, like water you could see but never quite reach. Hollywood discovered her in 1940, saw something in her face, a sultriness combined with aloofness, sexy but untouchable. Paramount put her under contract and immediately realized they had something special. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but the camera made her seem larger, more present. They gave her the peekaboo hairstyle, blonde waves that fell across her right eye, creating mystery and allure. In 1941, she was cast opposite Joel McCrea in Sullivan's Travels, then paired with Alan Ladd in This Gun for Hire. The chemistry was electric. Audiences couldn't get enough of the tiny blonde with the hidden eye and the voice that suggested secrets. But success came with pressure that her personality couldn't handle. She was difficult on set, argumentative with directors, resentful of the studio's control. They wanted her to be the peekaboo girl forever, wear the hair the same way, play variations of the same sultry character. She wanted to be taken seriously, to have range, to be more than a hairstyle. The drinking started as rebellion. Drinks between takes to steady her nerves. Drinks after work to quiet the anger. By 1943, she was one of the top 10 box office draws in America. The Blue Dahlia with Alan Ladd was a massive hit. Her image sold war bonds. Her hairstyle was so copied that the government eventually asked her to change it because women working in factories were getting their hair caught in machinery. She was, briefly, at the absolute peak of fame, and she was drinking a fifth of vodka every 2 days, sometimes more. The studio knew. They always knew. But she could still perform, could still hit her marks and deliver lines and look perfect on camera. So they looked away, the way studios did when the star was profitable. Her co-workers knew too. Crew members would find empty bottles in her dressing room, hidden in planters, tucked behind furniture. Her drinking was an open secret that everyone pretended not to notice. Her first marriage ended in 1943, her second in 1944. She married again in 1944 to director André de Toth, and that marriage was volatile from the start, fueled by her drinking and his temper. They had 2 children together, and Veronica tried to be a mother between films, but the vodka made everything difficult. She'd forget appointments, miss calls from the studio, show up to set hungover, and barely functional. By 1948, her career was declining. The peekaboo hairstyle had become dated. Film noir was evolving past the style she'd defined, and her reputation for being difficult and unreliable meant directors stopped requesting her. Paramount let her contract lapse. She was 26 years old, already on her way down. She worked sporadically through the 1950s, small roles in forgettable films, stage work when she could get it. But the drinking had progressed to the point where it was affecting everything. She'd forget lines during rehearsals, miss performances, show up drunk to interviews. Her third marriage ended in 1952. Her fourth, to a songwriter, lasted barely a year. The vodka was the only constant relationship in her life. By the late 1950s, she was essentially unemployable. Directors who might have given her a chance heard the stories, the drinking, the unreliability, the weight gain that had transformed her from sylph to something much more ordinary. She moved to New York, hoping for stage work, but theatre requires consistency. And consistency was impossible when you were drinking a bottle of vodka daily. She took the job at the Martha Washington Hotel in 1962 because she needed money for rent and vodka. The hotel was women only, respectable but fading, and they needed a bartender for the cocktail lounge. She applied under her real name, hoping no one would connect her to Veronica Lake. And mostly, no one did. She worked evening shifts, pouring drinks while sipping vodka from a glass she kept behind the bar, hidden among the mixers. The customers were mainly older women, hotel residents who came down for their evening cocktails. They'd sit at the bar and complain about their families, their health, their lives, and Veronica would nod sympathetically while refilling their glasses and her own. Sometimes a customer would stare at her, trying to place the face, and she'd see the exact moment they made the connection. Their expressions would shift, shock, then pity, then embarrassment. She hated the pity most of all. A journalist discovered her there in 1962 and wrote a feature that was picked up nationally. Veronica Lake serves drinks in Manhattan Hotel made her famous again, but famous in the worst way, as a cautionary tale, as proof of Hollywood's cruelty, as the star who'd fallen furthest. The publicity led to a few small offers, low-budget films, stage productions in regional theaters, but she was too damaged by then to capitalize on any of it. She kept drinking through the 1960s, her health deteriorating steadily. Alcohol had destroyed her liver, weakened her heart, given her hepatitis. She looked 20 years older than her actual age, the sultry pin-up replaced by a woman who could have been anyone, invisible in crowds, just another alcoholic drifting through New York's bars. Her last film was Flesh Feast in 1970, a horror movie so terrible it was barely released. She plays a mad scientist, and watching it is painful. She's bloated and slow, her famous voice slurred, her movements uncertain. It's hard to connect this woman to the sleek goddess of the 1940s. The vodka had consumed everything else. On July 7, 1973, Veronica Lake died of hepatitis and acute kidney injury at a hospital in Burlington, Vermont. She was 50 years old. She'd been living in poverty, her final week spent in pain as her organs failed. The newspapers ran obituaries with her famous photo, the peekaboo hair, the sultry gaze, and beneath it, the story of her decline. Most focused on the bartending job, the symbol of how far she'd fallen. They buried her quietly. Hollywood didn't attend. She'd been forgotten years before her death, replaced by newer faces, fresher images. Her children remembered her as a difficult mother, loving but unreliable, always with a glass in her hand, always promising to quit tomorrow. The vodka had started as rebellion, as self-medication for the pressures of fame and the resentment of being reduced to a hairstyle. But it became its own prison, more confining than anything the studio had demanded. The peekaboo hair had hidden one eye. The vodka had hidden everything else. The talent, the person, the life that might have been possible if she'd found some other way to cope with being turned into an image and then watching that image become obsolete. In the end, The woman behind the hair disappeared completely, leaving only bottles and regrets and a few perfect films where you can see her as she was before the drinking took hold, before fame and alcohol conspired to erase her. The story you're about to hear is about the horror icon's bulging eyes and unusual energy coming from morphine addiction. Started after a gallbladder surgery and never stopped. It reveals what happens when legitimate pain treatment becomes lifelong dependency, when a man's most distinctive feature is actually a symptom of addiction. How does the eyes that made him famous become windows into his private hell? Picture the Warner Brothers lot, 1947. In a dressing room, a small round man sits before a mirror, preparing for another day of playing villains and psychopaths. His eyes are his trademark, large, bulging slightly, with a quality that suggests either madness or profound sadness depending on the lighting. What the mirror doesn't show is the reason for that distinctive look, the morphine in his system, elevating his blood pressure, affecting the muscles around his eyes, creating the appearance that made him perfect for roles that required unsettling intensity. This is Peter Lorre, and he's been taking morphine for 13 years, since a surgery that was supposed to help him, but instead gave him an addiction he'll never escape. He was born Laszlo Löwenstein in 1904 in Austria-Hungary, a Jewish boy in an empire that would soon collapse. He became an actor in his 20s, working in German theatre and film, and in 1931 he was cast in M, Fritz Lang's masterpiece about a child murderer. Lorre's performance was extraordinary, sympathetic and monstrous simultaneously, his soft features and expressive eyes creating a character that was both pitiable and terrifying. The film made him internationally famous and established him as someone who could play darkness with nuance. He fled Germany in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, eventually making his way to Hollywood in 1935. His English was poor, learned phonetically, but his presence transcended language barriers. Hollywood immediately cast him as villains, as foreigners, as sinister figures whose accent and appearance suggested menace. He was the villain in the Mr. Moto films, appeared in Casablanca, became one of the most recognizable character actors in the industry. In 1940, he developed severe gallbladder problems, pain so intense he could barely work. The surgery to remove the gallbladder was successful, and his doctor prescribed morphine for the post-operative pain. This was standard practice before anyone fully understood addiction, before doctors realized that some patients couldn't stop once they started. Lorre took the morphine as directed, found that it eliminated not just the physical pain, but also the anxiety and depression that had plagued him for years. When the prescription ran out, he asked for more. His doctor was initially hesitant, but relented when Lorre explained he was still in pain. Whether that pain was physical or psychological became irrelevant. The morphine addressed both, and Lorre had found something he couldn't give up. He increased the doses gradually, his body adapting, requiring more to achieve the same effect. By 1942, he was taking morphine daily, obtaining it through a network of doctors who either didn't know about each other or didn't care. The morphine affected his appearance in subtle ways that became his trademark. His eyes bulged slightly more, a side effect of elevated blood pressure and fluid retention. His movements took on a dreamy quality, slow and deliberate, which made him perfect for playing characters who existed slightly outside normal reality. His voice, already distinctive with its soft European accent, became even more controlled. Each word carefully enunciated by a mind working through chemical fog. Directors and co-stars noticed his dependency, but said nothing. Hollywood in the 1940s was full of addicts, and as long as Lorre could work, his morphine use was his business. He was professional, knew his lines, hit his marks. The fact that he did all this while heavily medicated seemed almost impressive. His performances in The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca show no obvious signs of impairment. He's sharp, intense, fully present despite the drugs in his system. But the addiction took its toll privately. His marriage to actress Karen Verne was strained by his dependency, his need to maintain his supply creating stress that affected everything. He'd become anxious and irritable when his morphine was running low, would disappear for hours to obtain more, returning calm and functional. She tried to help him quit, staged an intervention with his friends, but morphine had him completely by then. By the late 1940s, Lorre was consuming amounts that would kill a non-addicted person. His tolerance had built to the point where the doses he needed just to feel normal were enormous. He tried to quit several times, checking into sanitariums for detoxification, but withdrawal was agony, sweating, shaking, nausea, and worse, the return of the anxiety and depression that morphine had been masking for years. He'd last days or weeks before using again, each relapse confirming that he'd never be free. The addiction affected his career in ways both obvious and subtle. He gained weight, his round face becoming rounder, his body soft and puffy from the metabolic effects of chronic morphine use. His energy levels were inconsistent. Some days he'd be bright and engaged, other days barely conscious. Directors learned to schedule his scenes carefully, shooting early in the day when he was most reliable. He moved to Germany in the 1950s, hoping a change of location might help him quit. It didn't. The morphine followed him, obtained through European doctors, the addiction transcending geography. He directed one film, Der Verlorene, a dark psychological drama that reflected his own internal state. The film was a commercial failure, but showed what he might have accomplished if addiction hadn't consumed so much of his energy. Returning to Hollywood in the late 1950s, Lorre found the industry had changed. The roles he'd played were less in demand. Television was eating away at the studio system, and he was in his 50s, overweight, visibly unwell. He worked when he could. Roger Corman horror films, television appearances, voice work. The morphine continued, his body now so dependent that stopping would likely kill him through withdrawal complications. His health deteriorated rapidly in the early 1960s. The morphine had damaged his cardiovascular system, his heart working too hard for too long under chemical strain. He developed severe hypertension, had difficulty breathing, suffered from chronic fatigue. Doctors warned him that his heart could fail at any time. He understood but couldn't stop. The addiction had progressed beyond choice. His body needed morphine to function. Stopping meant suffering, and suffering meant using again. On March 23, 1964. Peter Lorre died of a stroke in his Los Angeles apartment. He was 59 years old. His body was found with bottles of morphine nearby, prescriptions from multiple doctors. The infrastructure of his addiction laid out in pharmaceutical evidence. The autopsy revealed an enlarged heart, damaged blood vessels, a system that had been under chemical siege for 24 years. The funeral was attended by his Hollywood colleagues, people who'd known about his addiction but had accepted it as part of who he was. They remembered his talent, his distinctive presence, the way he'd made even small roles memorable. Few mentioned the morphine, the addiction that had shaped his appearance and his life for more than 2 decades. His eyes had made him famous. Those bulging, expressive eyes that could convey madness or melancholy with a single glance. What audiences never knew was that those eyes were partly a product of morphine, that the look that made him perfect for playing disturbed characters was itself a symptom of his disturbance. Peter Lorre had become his addiction, his most distinctive features inseparable from the drugs that slowly killed him, until the stroke finally stopped his damaged heart and released him from the dependency that had defined the second half of his life. The story you're about to hear is about a woman labeled insane, when she was really self-medicating with alcohol and benzodrine, spiraling through arrests and commitments that may have been addiction-driven breakdowns. It reveals what happens when mental illness and substance abuse become impossible to separate, when a society treats addiction as insanity and destroys a woman in the process. How does a promising actress become a cautionary tale about things that may never have happened? Picture a courtroom in Santa Monica, 1943. A woman in handcuffs stands before a judge, her hair disheveled, her clothes rumpled from a night in jail. She's been arrested for driving drunk, though the alcohol is only part of the story. In her system is all benzodrine, the amphetamine she's been taking daily for years, mixing it with bourbon in combinations that make her unpredictable, volatile, occasionally violent. The judge sees a woman out of control, a danger to herself and others. What he doesn't see is addiction, because that language doesn't exist yet, not in the way it needs to. This is Frances Farmer, and she's about to disappear into a system that will treat her as criminally insane when she's really just an addict who can't stop. Frances Eleanor Farmer was born in 1913 in Seattle. Brilliant and beautiful and rebellious from the start. She won essay contests with titles like God Dies, causing scandals in her conservative town. She was intellectually ferocious, politically radical, the kind of girl who read Marx and debated communism and made people nervous with her intensity. Hollywood discovered her in 1936, saw her intelligence and beauty and thought they could package her as the thinking man's starlet. Paramount put her under contract and immediately tried to smooth her rough edges. But Frances wouldn't smooth. She argued with directors, criticized scripts, refused to do publicity that she found demeaning. The studio saw her as difficult. She saw herself as unwilling to compromise her integrity for their commercial interests. The conflict was fundamental and irreconcilable. The drinking started as defiance, alcohol being one of the few things she could control in a life increasingly controlled by the studio. She'd drink between takes, drinks that started as rebellion and became necessity. By 1938, she was drinking daily, bourbon mostly, enough to keep the edges soft, to make the compromises bearable. The studio knew but didn't care as long as she could work. Then came the Benzedrine, provided by a studio doctor who said it would help with energy and focus. The amphetamines made her sharp and quick and able to work long hours without flagging. They also made her irritable, paranoid, prone to outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere. Mixed with alcohol, the combination created a volatility that made her increasingly difficult to work with. Her mood swings became legendary. She'd be charming one moment, screaming at someone, the next, the chemicals in, her system creating reactions she couldn't predict or control. By 1942, her career was effectively over. She'd walked out on her Paramount contract, had been labeled unreliable and difficult, couldn't get hired for major productions. She returned to Seattle, hoping to find work in theater, but the drinking and drugs followed her. Her mother, a controlling woman who'd always disapproved of Francis's choices, saw an opportunity to reassert control. The arrests began that year: drunk driving, disorderly conduct, assault when she fought with police officers who tried to restrain her. The newspapers covered each incident, portraying Francis as unhinged, out of control, dangerous. No one discussed addiction because addiction wasn't understood then, especially not the kind that mixed alcohol and amphetamines, that created behaviors that looked like mental illness, but were really chemical reactions. In January 1943, after a particularly violent arrest, where she'd fought with multiple police officers, a judge declared her incompetent and committed her to a psychiatric facility. This is where the story becomes murky, where legend and reality separate and become impossible to untangle. Francis was institutionalized on and off for the next 7 years, and what happened to her during those institutionalizations has been the subject of speculation, sensationalism, and outright fabrication. The legend says she was lobotomized, that the operation destroyed her personality and turned her into a docile shell. The evidence suggests this probably didn't happen, that the lobotomy story was invented by a sensationalist biography decades later. But something happened during those years. Treatments, certainly. Shock therapy, probably. Abuses, possibly. She emerged from the institutions changed, quieter, less combative. Whether that was healing or breaking is impossible to determine. What's clear is that the alcohol and Benzedrine continued whenever she had access to them. The institutions would dry her out, she'd be released, and she'd start using again within days or weeks. The pattern repeated: arrest, commitment, release, relapse. Each cycle confirmed to observers that she was insane, when really she was an addict caught in a system that couldn't distinguish between mental illness and substance abuse. Her mother controlled much of her institutionalization, signing commitment papers, making decisions about her treatment. There was clearly pathology in that relationship, though whether it was Francis's mental illness or her mother's need for control or some toxic combination of both is unknowable from this distance. What's certain is that Francis, in her rare lucid moments, understood she was trapped, that the system treating her was making her worse, not better. By 1950, after multiple commitments and releases, she'd been institutionalized more or less continuously, for 7 years. The Frances Farmer who emerged was not the same woman who'd gone in. Whether the institutions broke her, or helped her, or simply held her until the addiction burned itself out, is impossible to say. She was quieter, more compliant, the fire that had defined her seemingly extinguished. She worked occasionally in the 1950s, small television roles, stage work in local theatre. She stayed mostly sober, or at least controlled her drinking enough to function. In 1958, she hosted a television show in Indianapolis, proving she could still perform, could still connect with audiences. But the damage was permanent. The years of alcohol and amphetamines and institutionalization had taken something essential, left her going through the motions of life without the intensity that had once defined her. On August 1st, 1970, Frances Farmer died of esophageal cancer in Indianapolis. She was 56 years old. The cancer was likely related to years of heavy drinking, the alcohol having damaged tissues that eventually turned malignant. Her death was noted briefly in the newspapers, her obituary focusing on the scandals and institutionalizations, the narrative of the troubled actress who went insane. But the insanity was never the full story. Frances Farmer was an addict, mixing alcohol and amphetamines in ways that created behaviors that looked like mental illness to people who didn't understand addiction. The system that committed her saw a crazy woman who needed to be controlled. What they were really seeing was someone whose self-medication had spiraled out of control, whose chemical dependency created volatility that got labeled insanity. The lobotomy legend persists because it's a better story, more dramatic, clearer villain. But the truth is probably sadder and more mundane. A brilliant woman who started drinking to cope with Hollywood's demands, added amphetamines for energy, found that the combination made her impossible to control, and got swept into a mental health system that destroyed her, not through dramatic surgery, but through years of incremental damage, treating symptoms without addressing causes, punishing addiction because they called it insanity, and locked her away until she finally, quietly, gave up. The story you're about to hear is about the noir tough guy who didn't hide his pot smoking, leading to a 1948 arrest that was partially a studio publicity stunt. But the addiction was real. It reveals what happens when rebellion becomes habit, when the thing that makes you seem dangerous becomes the thing you actually need. How does a man who smoked marijuana as a statement end up unable to stop? Picture a cottage in Laurel Canyon, August 31st, 1948, just after midnight. Police burst through the door to find several people in various states of undress and the air thick with marijuana smoke. Robert Mitchum, the 29-year-old star of Out of the Past, sits on a couch with a joint in his hand, barely reacting to the raid. He doesn't run, doesn't hide the evidence, just watches the police with the same heavy-lidded indifference that made him a star. "Well, this is it," he says, more curious than concerned. The arrest will become legendary, the scandal that somehow made him more popular. But the marijuana use that led to it, that's been part of his life since adolescence. That will continue until the day he dies. That's the real story. Robert Charles Derman. Mitchum was born in 1917 in Connecticut into a family marked by his father's death when Robert was 2. He grew up poor, drifting through the Depression, riding freight trains at 14, working odd jobs, occasionally getting arrested for vagrancy. He tried marijuana for the first time at 16, offered by another rail rider somewhere in the Southwest. The drug provided a buffer against hunger and exhaustion, made the uncertainty of Depression-era wandering slightly more bearable. By the time he reached Hollywood in the early 1940s, marijuana was part of his daily routine. He smoked before auditions to calm his nerves, between takes to maintain a certain looseness in his performances, after work to come down from the stress of filming. His colleagues knew, everyone knew, but marijuana wasn't yet demonized the way it would become. And besides, Mitchum made it seem cool, part of his outlaw image. He became a star playing exactly that: outlaws, tough guys, men who existed outside conventional morality. In noir films like Build My Gallows High and Crossfire, he brought a quality of dangerous unpredictability, a sense that violence could erupt at any moment. Part of that came from natural talent, but part came from the marijuana. The way it made him slightly removed from the scene, observing rather than fully participating, giving his performances that distinctive Mitchum quality of bemused detachment. The 1948 arrest was theatre, at least partially. RKO Studios was worried that Mitchum was too much of a good thing, too handsome, too talented, too successful. They wanted an edge, something that would make him seem dangerous in real life, not just on screen. Whether they actually arranged the raid or simply didn't prevent it is debated, but the timing was suspiciously perfect. Mitchum and several others were arrested, marijuana was found, and the publicity was enormous. The trial became a spectacle. Mitchum pled guilty, served 60 days in county jail, and emerged more popular than before. The arrest had made him legendary, the bad boy who actually was bad, who'd gone to jail and come out unrepentant. His films played to packed theaters. Fan mail increased. Hollywood had learned an important lesson. Sometimes scandal sells better than wholesome image. But the marijuana use wasn't an act. Mitchum was genuinely addicted, psychologically, if not physically, unable to function comfortably without it. He'd smoke before breakfast, during lunch breaks, after dinner, before bed. His consumption was constant, his tolerance high, his need real, even if he'd never admit to needing anything. Through the 1950s and 1960s, he continued smoking despite the arrest, despite the ongoing scrutiny, despite the legal risks. He was more careful, smoked at home rather than at parties. But he never stopped. Directors learned to work around it, schedule the difficult scenes in the morning, keep the afternoon shoots simple. Don't expect much after 5 p.m. when he'd be thoroughly stoned. His performances during these decades show the effects subtly. The heavy-lidded gaze became heavier, his speech patterns slower, more deliberate. In Night of the Hunter and Cape Fear, he's menacing, partly because he seems removed from normal emotional responses, operating on some different frequency. That quality came from marijuana as much as from acting technique, the drug creating a barrier between him and the immediate world that translated perfectly to villainous roles. His family tolerated his habit, the way families tolerate manageable addictions. His wife Dorothy knew he smoked constantly, accepted it as part of who he was, though it created tensions. His children grew up with the smell of marijuana in the house, their father perpetually slightly high, present but not entirely present, loving but filtered through chemical distance. The marijuana affected his memory, his motivation, his emotional availability. He'd forget commitments, show up late to family events, respond to crises with stoned equanimity that looked like strength but was really just numbness. His career continued successfully, but there were roles he turned down, projects he couldn't commit to, opportunities lost because marijuana had made him too passive to care about advancement. By the 1970s, marijuana culture had changed. What had been rebel behavior in the 1940s was mainstream by the hippie era, and Mitchum found himself accidentally fashionable again. Younger actors looked at him as a pioneer, someone who'd been smoking weed before it was cool. He accepted their admiration with the same heavy-lidded indifference he brought to everything, never mentioning that his decades of use had less to do with rebellion and more to do with dependency. His health deteriorated slowly. Marijuana's effects on the lungs are less severe than tobacco's, but real nonetheless. And Mitchum had smoked multiple joints daily for 50 years. He developed emphysema, had difficulty breathing, suffered from chronic bronchitis. Doctors told him to quit. He'd nod, smoke a joint, forget the conversation. The addiction, and it was addiction, regardless of debates about marijuana's addictive properties, had robbed him of urgency, of emotional depth, of the ability to be fully present in his own life. He'd spent decades slightly removed from reality, buffered by THC, experiencing everything through chemical distance. It had served him well professionally, creating the screen persona that made him iconic. But personally, it had cost him the possibility of being completely available to anyone, including himself. On July 1st, 1997, Robert Mitchum died of lung cancer and emphysema at his home in Santa Barbara. He was 79 years old, which is remarkable given the decades of marijuana smoke he'd inhaled. His lungs were severely damaged, their capacity reduced by years of chronic inflammation. The cancer that killed him almost certainly originated in tissues weakened by constant exposure to smoke. The obituaries focused on his acting, his screen presence, his iconic status in film noir and westerns. Most mentioned the 1948 arrest as colorful biography, proof of his rebel status. Few mentioned that he'd continued smoking marijuana every day for the next 49 years, that the arrest hadn't changed his behavior at all, that the drug had been a constant companion from adolescence to death. He'd made marijuana seem cool, made addiction look like choice, made dependency appear as casual habit. The image was so perfect that even he believed it, convinced himself that he smoked because he wanted to, not because he needed to. But addiction doesn't care about self-image. It had him completely, had him from 16 years old, and kept him until the damaged lungs finally gave out and released him from a habit he'd elevated to identity, but had never, not for a single day in 6 decades, managed to control. The story you're about to hear is about the Lorre star's mental breakdown being entangled with a barbiturate dependency. leading to electroshock treatments that may have been addressing the wrong problem. It reveals what happens when addiction masquerades as mental illness, when doctors treat symptoms without recognizing the chemical dependency underneath. How does sleeping pill addiction become depression, and depression become electroshock, and electroshock become the treatment that saves or destroys you? Picture the Harkness Pavilion Psychiatric Ward in New York, 1953. A woman lies on a gurney, electrodes attached to her temples, preparing for her third electroshock treatment in a week. She's been diagnosed with severe depression, though the doctors haven't connected her symptoms to the barbiturates she's been taking nightly for years, the sleeping pills that she needs to quiet the anxiety, to stop the thoughts, to sleep. This is Jean Tierney, who 3 years earlier was nominated for an Academy Award, whose face in Lorre defined cinematic beauty. The barbiturates brought her here. The electroshock will change her in ways no one can predict. Jean Eliza Tierney was born in 1920 in Brooklyn, into a wealthy family that valued appearances above almost everything else. She was beautiful from childhood, the kind of beauty that seemed almost unreal. Perfect features, luminous eyes, an ethereal quality that suggested she belonged in paintings rather than real life. She became a model, then an actress, and by 1940, she had a contract with 20th Century Fox. The studio recognized immediately what they had. Jean Tierney wasn't just beautiful. She was uniquely beautiful, her face almost geometrically perfect. They put her in film after film, often casting her as the unattainable woman, the feminine ideal that men destroyed themselves trying to possess. In 1944, she starred in Lorre, playing a woman so beautiful that a detective falls in love with her portrait. The role made her iconic, her face becoming synonymous with a certain kind of dangerous perfection. But perfection requires maintenance, and maintenance required chemical assistance. She developed insomnia in the early 1940s, the stress of constant filming and the pressure to remain flawless, making sleep difficult. A studio doctor prescribed barbiturates, sleeping pills that were handed out routinely in Hollywood, considered safe, not addictive in the way doctors would later understand. She took them as directed, and they worked perfectly, providing deep, dreamless sleep that let her wake refreshed and camera-ready. The doses increased gradually. By 1945, she needed 2 pills to sleep, where one had worked previously. By 1947, she was taking 3 or 4, her body adapting, requiring more to achieve the same effect. The barbiturates worked by depressing the central nervous system, and chronic use created a dependency that manifested as anxiety and insomnia whenever she tried to stop. The very symptoms she was trying to treat. Her personal life complicated everything. In 1943, she married Oleg Cassini, the fashion designer, and by 1944, she was pregnant. During that pregnancy, she contracted rubella, German measles, from a fan who'd met her at a USO event. The fan, who'd broken quarantine despite having measles, approached Tierney for an autograph. Weeks later, Tierney developed symptoms. Months after that, her daughter Daria was born severely disabled, deaf, blind, and intellectually impaired. The guilt destroyed her. She blamed herself for attending the event, for being accessible to fans, for not somehow knowing. The barbiturates, which had been for insomnia, became for grief, for the overwhelming sense of responsibility for her daughter's condition. She increased the doses, took them during the day now, not just at night, needing the chemical buffer between herself and the reality of what had happened. By 1950, she was taking barbiturates almost constantly, her mood swinging wildly between the chemical highs and lows of chronic use. She'd be energetic and functional one day, barely able to get out of bed the next. The studios noticed her unreliability, but attributed it to emotional problems rather than chemical dependency. Her marriage to Cassini ended in 1952, the relationship unable to survive the combined weight of their daughter's condition and Jean's increasing instability. She attempted suicide that year, taking an overdose of sleeping pills, the same pills she'd been using daily for nearly a decade. She survived, was hospitalized, and the doctors diagnosed severe depression. The barbiturate dependency went unrecognized, or at least unacknowledged. This was 1952, before the medical establishment fully understood how barbiturate addiction could mimic and exacerbate mental illness. The treatment was electroshock therapy, the standard approach for severe depression. She received dozens of sessions over the next year, electricity passing through her brain, inducing seizures, supposedly resetting the neural patterns that caused depression. The treatments left her disoriented, with gaps in her memory, but the doctors considered them successful because her acute suicidal ideation decreased. What decreased, along with the suicidal thoughts, was much of her personality. Electroshock therapy, especially administered as frequently as Tierney received it, causes memory loss and personality changes that can be permanent. She emerged from treatment quieter, less vibrant, her emotions flattened in ways that went beyond recovery and into diminishment. Friends who visited her noted how different she seemed, how the spark that had made her special appeared to have been extinguished along with whatever had been making her suicidal. The barbiturate use continued, though now under closer medical supervision. The addiction had never been addressed, only its symptoms, and those symptoms returned periodically throughout the 1950s. She'd have good periods where she worked and functioned, then crash into depression that required hospitalization and more electroshock. The cycle repeated: barbiturates, depression, electroshock, recovery, barbiturates, each rotation taking more from her. She attempted a comeback in 1960, appearing in Advise and Consent, giving a performance that showed flashes of her former brilliance. But the sustained work required for a career was beyond her now. The electroshock had damaged her memory, making it difficult to learn lines. The barbiturates made her unreliable. The combination meant she couldn't maintain the level of professionalism Hollywood required. In 1960, she married Texas oilman Howard Lee, a quiet man who provided stability and privacy. She retired from acting more or less permanently, occasionally appearing in small roles, but mainly living in Houston, away from Hollywood, away from the pressures that had contributed to her breakdown. Lee helped her slowly reduce her barbiturate use, though she never fully stopped, the addiction too deep-rooted to eliminate entirely. The electroshock therapy's effects lingered, She had significant memory gaps, couldn't recall large portions of her career or personal history. The treatment that had supposedly saved her from depression had also erased parts of the person she'd been. Whether the trade was worth it is impossible to say. She was alive, functioning, but something essential had been lost in the process. On November 6, 1991, Jean Tierney died of emphysema in Houston. She was 70 years old. Her later years had been peaceful, her marriage to Lee providing the stability her earlier life had lacked. But the damage from the barbiturates and electroshock remained. The memories that never came back, the personality changes that were permanent, the career that had been sacrificed to survival. The obituaries focused on Lorre, on her beauty, on her status as one of Hollywood's most iconic faces. Few mentioned the barbiturate addiction that had started as simple insomnia treatment and ended in electroshock therapy. Fewer still questioned whether the treatment had been necessary, whether the depression the doctors had treated with electricity had been caused by the pills they'd never stopped prescribing. Jean Tierney had been beautiful enough to play the unattainable woman, and she'd become unattainable in ways the scripts never intended. Lost first to sleeping pills that created the very insomnia they were meant to cure, then to electroshock that treated addiction as insanity and erased large portions of who she'd been in the process. The Lorre portrait remained perfect, frozen in 1944, while the woman who'd posed for it disappeared behind barbiturates and memory loss, becoming a ghost of the perfection she'd represented, until even that ghost finally faded into the peace of a quiet death, far from the cameras that had made her immortal.